David Thompson stared at the stack of reports on his desk, each one telling the same troubling story. Employee satisfaction was down 15%. Productivity had dropped for 3 straight months. And worst of all, good people were leaving the company faster than ever before. As the CEO of Blue Tech Manufacturing, David thought he knew his company inside and out. After all, he had built it from the ground up over the past 12 years. What started as a small operation with just 10 employees had grown into a thriving business with over 500 workers across 2 shifts. But somewhere along the way, something had gone wrong. The latest HR report sat open in front of him, filled with complaints he couldn't quite understand. Workers felt disconnected from management. They claimed their concerns weren't being heard. Some even said they felt invisible, like no one cared about them as people. David rubbed his temples. How could this be happening? He had always tried to be a fair boss. The company offered decent benefits, competitive pay, and he had an open-door policy. At least that's what he told himself. His assistant knocked and entered with his afternoon coffee. "Mr. Thompson, the monthly management meeting is in 10 minutes. "Thanks, Linda." David took the coffee and sighed. Another meeting where his managers would give him polished reports that somehow never seemed to match what the employees were actually saying. That evening, David stayed late in his corner office on the 4th floor. The building was quieter now, with most of the day shift gone home. Through his window, he could see the night crew arriving for their 10 o'clock start. These were people he rarely saw, workers who kept the company running while he slept. He thought about his own journey. 20 years ago, he had worked nights at a factory just like this one. He remembered the exhaustion, the feeling that the bosses didn't understand what it was really like on the floor. Back then, he had promised himself that if he ever ran a company, he would never lose touch with the people doing the real work. But when was the last time he had actually talked to someone on the night shift? When had he last walked through the plant after hours? The honest answer made him uncomfortable. David pulled out his phone and searched for something he had read about a few months ago. There it was, an article about a restaurant owner who worked undercover in his own establishments. The man had discovered problems he never knew existed and learned things that transformed his entire business. Could he do something like that? The idea seemed crazy at first, but the more David thought about it, the more sense it made. How else could he really understand what was happening in his own company? The next morning, David called Linda into his office. "I need you to do something unusual, and I need you to keep it completely confidential." Linda raised an eyebrow. In 12 years of working for David, she had seen him make bold decisions, but something in his tone suggested this was different. "I want to work undercover in our own company." "As a regular employee, sir? I need to see what's really happening here. Not what the reports say, not what the managers tell me, but what it's actually like to work here." Linda sat down slowly. "That's actually brilliant. But how would we make it work?" They spent the next 2 hours planning. David would take a 2-week vacation officially. Unofficially, he would return as Mike Wilson, a temporary maintenance worker hired through their usual temp agency. Linda would handle the fake paperwork and background, working secretly with one trusted person in HR. The biggest challenge would be David's appearance. Everyone knew the CEO's face from company newsletters and meetings. So David did something he had never done before. He grew a beard. For 2 weeks, he avoided all company events and public appearances, letting his facial hair grow thick and changing his usual neat appearance. He also had to learn to dress differently. Gone were the tailored suits and expensive shoes. Instead, David bought work boots, blue jeans, and plain t-shirts from a discount store. He practiced changing his voice, speaking more casually, and even studied how to walk differently. The night before his first shift, David looked at himself in the mirror. The beard, combined with a baseball cap and work clothes, had transformed him completely. His own mother might not recognize him, but the real test would come at work. At 9:45 p.m. on a Monday night, David, now Mike Wilson, walked through the employee entrance he had never used before. His hands were sweating as he approached the security desk. "First night?" asked the guard, a friendly older man named Pete. "Yeah, I'm Mike. Supposed to report to Betty Williams." Pete checked his list and handed David a temporary badge. "Betty's a good supervisor. She'll take care of you. Head down that hallway and look for the maintenance office." David found Betty Williams organizing supplies in a small office that smelled of cleaning chemicals and coffee. She was a woman in her 50s with graying hair and kind eyes that looked like they had seen everything. "You must be Mike. Welcome to the night shift." Betty shook his hand with a firm grip. "Ever done maintenance work before?" David had practiced this answer. "Some, but I'm willing to learn." "Good attitude. That's what counts around here." Betty handed him a uniform shirt and a belt with basic tools. "Tonight, you'll shadow me and learn the routine. We cover floors 3 through 5. Day shift handles the rest." As they walked through the building, David saw his company from a completely different angle. The hallways he knew so well looked different at night. The offices that seemed so professional during the day now looked cold and empty. "First thing you need to know," Betty said as they entered a supply closet, "is that this work matters. People think janitors are invisible, but we're not. A clean workplace keeps everyone healthy and happy. Don't let anyone tell you this job isn't important." David felt a pang of guilt. How many times had he walked past maintenance workers without really seeing them? They started in the accounting department. Betty showed him how to empty trash cans efficiently, clean desks without disturbing personal items, and vacuum carpets in a pattern that wouldn't leave marks. "The trick," Betty explained, "is to clean everything like it's your own home. Take pride in the work, even if others don't notice." The work was harder than David had expected. By midnight, his back ached from bending over to empty trash cans. His hands were already getting rough from handling cleaning supplies, and they were only 1/3 through their assigned areas. "You okay?" Betty asked, noticing David wiping sweat from his forehead. "Just getting used to it. It takes time. Most people don't realize how physical this job is. We walk miles every night, lift hundreds of pounds of trash, and work with chemicals that can be tough on your skin." As they moved through the offices, David noticed things he had never seen before. Coffee stains on carpets that had been there so long they seemed permanent. Broken chairs that nobody had bothered to report. Bathrooms that needed repairs the day shift had ignored. But he also noticed how carefully Betty worked. She didn't just clean. She fixed small problems, organized cluttered areas, and even watered plants that looked thirsty. "Why do you do all these extra things?" David asked. Betty smiled. "Because somebody has to care. If we don't take care of this place, who will?" That simple question hit David harder than any report or meeting ever had. Here was someone who cared more about his company than he had realized, and she was just one person on one shift. As the night went on, David began to understand that he had been living in a bubble. The real heart of his company wasn't in the boardroom or the executive offices. It was right here with people like Betty who showed up every night and took pride in work that most people never even noticed. By 7 a.m., David was exhausted, but enlightened. His first night undercover had already taught him more about his company than years of management reports. And this was just the beginning. By his third night as Mike Wilson, David was starting to feel like he belonged on the night shift. His muscles were adjusting to the physical work, and he had learned the rhythm of cleaning offices, restocking supplies, and maintaining the building that he had owned for over a decade. Betty had been patient with him, teaching him tricks that made the work easier. How to wrap the vacuum cord so it wouldn't tangle, which cleaning products worked best on different surfaces, and most importantly, how to move through the building efficiently without wasting time or energy. "You're getting the hang of it," Betty said as they finished cleaning the second floor. "Most temps don't last more than a week. This work isn't for everyone." David felt a strange sense of pride at her compliment. When was the last time someone had genuinely praised his effort, rather than just agreeing with him because he was the boss? Tonight, Betty had assigned him to work more independently. "I need to handle some maintenance issues on the first floor," she explained. "You take the third floor supply closets, restock everything, check the inventory sheets, and make sure nothing's running low." David nodded and headed upstairs with his cart full of supplies. The third floor was quieter than usual. Most of the office lights were off, and the only sounds were the distant hum of computers and the building's air conditioning system. He started with the supply closet near the elevator. Paper towels, toilet paper, cleaning chemicals, light bulbs. Everything had its place on metal shelving that reached from floor to ceiling. David checked each item against the list on his SIC. Lipboard, making notes of what needed to be reordered. The work was methodical and somehow relaxing. There was something satisfying about organizing things, making sure everything was in its proper place. No wonder Betty took pride in this job. As he moved to the second supply closet, David noticed something different about this floor. During the day, it housed the company's accounting and human resources departments. These were people he saw regularly in meetings, people who seemed professional and put together. But now, seeing their workspaces at night, he noticed things he had missed before. One desk had a photo of someone's sick father next to a stack of medical bills. Another had a note about needing to work extra hours to pay for their child's school supplies. These weren't just employees. They were real people with real struggles. David was lost in thought as he approached the third supply closet, the largest one at the end of the hall. He pulled out his keys and unlocked the door, reaching for the light switch. But before he could flip it on, he heard something that made him freeze. Soft, rhythmic breathing. Someone was sleeping. David's first instinct was to turn on the light and see who was in there. Company policy was clear. Employees weren't allowed to sleep on the job. It was grounds for immediate termination. But something made him hesitate. The breathing was so peaceful, so tired-sounding. It reminded him of his own children when they were young. Exhausted after a long day of playing, instead of the light switch, David quietly pulled out his phone and used its flashlight, keeping the beam low and pointed toward the floor. What he saw made his heart skip a beat. In the back corner of the supply closet, behind stacks of paper towels and cleaning supplies, someone had created a makeshift bed. Cardboard had been carefully laid out on the floor and covered with clean rags from the maintenance supply. A small pillow, probably brought from home, supported the head of a man David didn't recognize. The man appeared to be in his late 50s, with graying hair and hands that looked like they had done decades of hard work. His uniform shirt was clean but worn, and his work boots were placed neatly beside his improvised bed. Even in sleep, there was a carefulness about how he had arranged everything. Nothing was messy or careless. David stood there for a long moment, his mind racing. This was clearly a violation of company rules. Any manager would report this immediately. The man would be fired before the end of his shift. But something about the scene troubled David in a way he couldn't explain. This wasn't someone being lazy or trying to avoid work. The care with which the sleeping area had been arranged suggested something else entirely. This felt desperate, like someone who had no other choice. David quietly backed out of the closet and closed the door softly. His hands were shaking as he walked back to his supply cart. What should he do? What was the right thing to do? He tried to focus on restocking the other closets, but his mind kept returning to what he had seen. Who was this man? Why was he sleeping at work? And why did David feel like there was more to this story than what appeared on the surface? As he worked, David found himself paying more attention to the other night shift workers he encountered. There was Jimmy, the security guard who always seemed to be drinking coffee and looked tired around the eyes. There was Rosa, who cleaned the bathrooms and always had a kind word for everyone, but whose uniform looked like it had been washed 100 times. These were people who worked while the rest of the world slept. They kept the building running, kept it clean and safe, and most of the day shift employees never even saw them. David realized he had been one of those day shift people, never really thinking about who emptied his trash or cleaned his office. Around 3 in the morning, David was finishing up the supply inventory when he heard footsteps in the hallway. He looked up to see a man walking toward the third supply closet, the same man he had seen sleeping there earlier. David quickly busied himself with his clipboard, trying to look occupied while keeping an eye on what happened next. The man unlocked the supply closet with his own key and disappeared inside. A few minutes later, he emerged looking more alert and headed toward the elevator. David waited until the man was gone, then quietly approached the supply closet again. Using his phone's flashlight, he could see that the makeshift bed had been carefully put away. The cardboard was folded and tucked behind some boxes. The rags were neatly stacked. Even the pillow had been hidden where it wouldn't be noticed unless someone was specifically looking for it. Whoever this man was, he was being incredibly careful not to interfere with the actual work or storage in the closet. He had found a way to rest without taking up any space needed for supplies or creating a mess that others would have to clean up. David realized he was looking at someone who was probably desperate but still respectful, someone who needed this job badly enough to risk everything, but who cared enough about his co-workers not to make their jobs harder. The rest of the night passed in a blur. David couldn't concentrate on his work. Every few minutes, his thoughts returned to the supply closet and the man who had been sleeping there. He found himself watching other workers, wondering what stories they carried with them, what struggles they faced that never made it into the company's employee satisfaction surveys. When Betty found him near the end of their shift, she noticed his distraction immediately. "Everything okay, Mike? You seem a million miles away." David looked at his supervisor, this woman who had been nothing but kind and professional with him. Could he trust her with what he had discovered? Should he tell her about the sleeping man? "Betty, can I ask you something?" "Sure. Do you know all the people who work the night shift?" Betty thought for a moment. "Most of them. We're a smaller crew than the day shift, so we tend to know each other pretty well." Why, David hesitated. "I saw someone I didn't recognize." Older guy, gray hair, looked really tired, and that sounds like Carlos. "Carlos Rivera. He's been here longer than almost anyone. Maybe 12 years? He usually works the East Wing, but sometimes he helps out wherever we need him." "Carlos," David repeated, finally having a name for the man in the supply closet. "Good worker," Betty continued. "Never complains, always willing to take on extra shifts. Actually, he's been looking pretty worn out lately. I've been meaning to check on him, make sure he's okay." David nodded, but inside he was thinking that Carlos was definitely not okay. A man who had been with the company for 12 years was sleeping in supply closets. Something was very wrong, and David realized he needed to understand what that something was before he decided what to do about it. As his shift ended, and David headed home in the early morning light, he knew his investigation was just beginning. David couldn't get Carlos out of his mind. For the rest of that week, he found himself watching for the older janitor every night, trying to understand what was really happening without being obvious about it. On Thursday night, David made sure to arrive at work 15 minutes early. He wanted to see who got there first and how the night shift really began. As he walked through the employee entrance, he was surprised to see Carlos already in the building, checking supplies and organizing his cleaning cart. "That guy's always here first," said Pete, the security guard, noticing David's glance. "Carlos gets here around 9:30 every night, even though shift doesn't start until 10. Never seen anyone more reliable." David filed that information away and headed to find Betty. Throughout the night, he made excuses to work in areas where he might cross paths with Carlos. He wanted to observe the man without making it obvious. What he saw impressed him. Despite looking tired, Carlos worked with a care and attention that David rarely saw in any employee. When Carlos cleaned an office, he didn't just empty the trash and vacuum. He straightened crooked picture frames, organized scattered papers on desks, and even wiped down computer screens that didn't really need cleaning. In the bathroom on the second floor, David watched Carlos notice a loose toilet handle. Instead of just reporting it, Carlos pulled a small tool from his belt and fixed it himself. It was a 2-minute repair that saved the company a maintenance call. "Carlos seems like a really dedicated worker," David mentioned to Betty during their break. "One of the best we've ever had," Betty agreed. "Never calls in sick, never complains, always volunteers when someone else can't make their shift. Management should give him a raise, but you know how that goes." David did know how that went. As CEO, he realized he had never even heard Carlos's name mentioned in management meetings. The man had been invisible to the executive team despite being one of their most reliable employees. Over the next few nights, David began casual conversations with other night shift workers, trying to learn more about Carlos without seeming too interested. "Carlos, that man's a saint," said Rosa, who cleaned the executive bathrooms. "Last month when my son was sick and I had to miss 3 shifts, Carlos covered for me without being asked. Worked double shifts and never complained once." Jimmy, the other security guard, had similar stories. "Carlos helped me move my mother into a nursing home last year. Came by on his day off with his truck and wouldn't take any money for gas. Just said we're all family here." The picture that emerged was of a man who went above and beyond for everyone around him. Carlos wasn't just a good employee. He was someone who genuinely cared about his coworkers and his job, which made the supply closet situation even more puzzling. Why would someone so dedicated to his work risk everything by sleeping on the job? It didn't make sense unless something serious was going on in Carlos's life. David decided he needed to learn more about Carlos's personal situation. During another break, he approached Tony, a maintenance worker who had been with the company almost as long as Carlos. "Tony, can I ask you something? Carlos seems like a really private guy. Does he ever talk about his family or what he does outside of work? Tony lowered his voice. Carlos doesn't talk much about personal stuff, but I know he's married. Been with his wife for a long time. Real devoted to her from what I can tell. Does she work too? Not anymore. I think she's been sick for a while now. Carlos never says much about it, but sometimes he looks really worried. And lately he's been looking exhausted. More than usual, I mean. This was the first hint David had gotten about what might be going on. A sick wife could explain a lot. Medical bills, stress, maybe even the need to work extra hours to pay for treatment. But it still didn't explain why Carlos was sleeping in the supply closet. On Sunday night, David's second week undercover, he positioned himself where he could watch Carlos more closely. The older man seemed more tired than ever. His movements were slower, and David noticed him rubbing his eyes several times during the shift. Around 2 a.m, David saw Carlos heading toward the third-floor supply closet again. This time, David waited 20 minutes, then quietly made his way upstairs. He could hear the soft sound of breathing from inside the closet. But instead of walking away like before, David decided to stay and see what happened when Carlos woke up. He found a spot around the corner where he could watch the closet door without being seen. 30 minutes later, Carlos emerged. He looked around carefully to make sure no one was watching, then headed toward the men's room. When he came back, he looked more alert and immediately got back to work. David followed at a distance and watched Carlos clean 3 offices with the same careful attention he always showed. Nothing about his work suggested someone who had been slacking off. If anything, Carlos seemed to work harder than anyone else on the night shift. The pieces weren't adding up, and David realized he needed to take a bigger risk to understand what was really happening. Tuesday night, David made a decision that he knew was crossing a line. When the shift ended at 7 a.m, instead of going home, he waited in his car in the parking lot to see where Carlos went. Carlos emerged from the building looking tired but walking with purpose. He got into an old Toyota that had seen better days and drove out of the parking lot. David followed, staying far enough back that Carlos wouldn't notice him. He expected Carlos to head home, maybe to a modest house or apartment somewhere in the city. Instead, Carlos drove straight to the highway and headed in the opposite direction from most of the residential neighborhoods. David's curiosity was now overwhelming his better judgment. He had to know where Carlos was going, and why a man who had just worked all night was driving somewhere instead of going home to sleep. The drive took almost an hour. Carlos drove carefully, never speeding, always using his turn signals. David could see the older man's head occasionally nodding as he fought off exhaustion behind the wheel. Finally, Carlos pulled into the parking lot of Mercy General Hospital. David felt his stomach drop. A hospital? Carlos's wife wasn't just sick. She was sick enough to be in the hospital. And Carlos was going there straight from his night shift instead of going home to rest. David parked far away and watched as Carlos walked slowly toward the main entrance. The man's shoulders were slumped with exhaustion, but his step quickened as he got closer to the building. Despite being tired beyond words, Carlos was eager to get inside. David sat in his car for a long time, staring at the hospital entrance where Carlos had disappeared. Suddenly, everything made sense. The sleeping in the supply closet, the extreme dedication to keeping his job, the exhaustion that went beyond normal work fatigue. Carlos wasn't just dealing with a sick wife. He was trying to be in 2 places at once, at work to keep his job and health insurance, and at the hospital to be with his wife when she needed him most. The supply closet wasn't about being lazy. It was about a man who was literally catching sleep wherever he could because he was spending every moment either working or caring for someone he loved. David realized he was looking at a kind of sacrifice he had never imagined. Carlos was destroying his own health and risking his job to be there for his wife while making sure she had the medical coverage she needed. As David drove home that morning, he knew he couldn't just pretend he hadn't seen this, but he also knew that Carlos had been hiding this situation for a reason. The man was proud, private, and probably terrified of losing the job that was keeping his wife's medical treatment possible. David had a choice to make. He could report what he had seen and follow company policy, or he could find another way to help, one that wouldn't destroy the life of a man who was already sacrificing everything for love. By the time David reached his own house, he knew what he had to do. But first, he needed to learn the whole story. David couldn't focus on anything for the rest of that Tuesday. He kept thinking about Carlos driving to the hospital after working all night, about the exhaustion in the older man's face, about the careful way he had arranged that makeshift bed in the supply closet. That evening, David made a decision that he knew crossed every professional boundary he had ever set for himself. Instead of going to work, he drove back to Mercy General Hospital. He needed to understand exactly what Carlos was dealing with before he decided what to do about it. The hospital lobby was busy even at 8 in the evening. Families coming and going, medical staff hurrying between departments, and the constant sound of overhead pages calling doctors to various wings. David found a seat in the waiting area where he could watch people come and go without being obvious about it. He didn't have to wait long. Around 8:30, he saw Carlos walking slowly down a hallway toward the elevator bank. The man looked different than he did at work. His shoulders were slumped. His face showed a deep sadness that he never let show during his shift. David waited a few minutes, then followed the path Carlos had taken. The elevator directory showed that the 3rd floor housed the oncology ward. Cancer patients. David felt his chest tighten. Carlos's wife wasn't just sick. She was fighting cancer. He took the elevator to the 3rd floor and carefully looked around. The oncology ward was quieter than the main hospital, with softer lighting and a gentleness in the way the staff moved and spoke. This was a place where families faced the worst news of their lives. At the nurses' station, David could see Carlos talking quietly with a woman in scrubs. Even from a distance, David could see the concern in the nurse's face as she spoke with Carlos. "Can I help you?" asked another nurse, noticing David standing uncertainly in the hallway. I'm looking for information about visiting someone," David said, thinking quickly. "Are you family?" "A friend. Carlos Rivera. I work with him and I wanted to check on his wife, but I wasn't sure about visiting hours." The nurse's expression softened immediately. "You work with Carlos? That man is incredible. He's been here every day for the past 2 months, never misses a single day. Every day, every single day. He usually gets here around 8 in the morning and stays until evening. Sometimes he even sleeps in the chair next to her bed." The nurse shook her head with admiration. "In 30 years of nursing, I've never seen devotion like that." David felt like the pieces of a puzzle were finally clicking into place, but the picture they formed was heartbreaking. "How is she doing?" David asked carefully. The nurse glanced around, then lowered her voice. "I really shouldn't discuss patient information, but since you're a friend, it's not good. We're doing everything we can, but at this stage it's really about comfort and making sure she's not alone." David thanked the nurse and walked slowly back toward the elevator, his mind racing. Carlos was working all night at the company, then spending all day at the hospital. When did he sleep? When did he eat? How was he even functioning? As the elevator doors opened, David saw Carlos again. This time, the older man was carrying 2 cups of coffee and walking toward a room at the end of the hall. David caught a glimpse through the doorway and saw a woman lying in a hospital bed, thin and frail, but smiling as Carlos entered the room. David made another impulsive decision. He needed to understand the full scope of what Carlos was dealing with. He walked to the family lounge area near the oncology ward and sat down with a magazine, positioned where he could observe without being noticed. Over the next 2 hours, David watched Carlos make trip after trip from his wife's room. Sometimes he went to get ice chips. Sometimes he talked with nurses about medications. Once he helped a woman who looked like she might be his wife's sister carry some personal items from the elevator. But mostly, Carlos just sat beside his wife's bed, holding her hand and talking quietly. From his position in the lounge, David could see into the room occasionally. Carlos read to his wife from what looked like a romance novel. He helped her sip water when she was thirsty, and when she fell asleep, David stepped forward. "Mrs. Rivera, your husband is one of the most dedicated employees our company has ever had. It's an honor to meet you. I don't understand. Carlos has been so worried about his job. He doesn't need to worry anymore," David said gently. "We're going to take care of everything." Over the next hour, David explained to Elena and Carlos how the company's new policies would work. He assured them that Carlos's job was secure, that all medical expenses would be covered, and that Carlos could focus entirely on being with his wife. "There's one more thing," David said as he prepared to leave. "The night shift crew, they're like family to Carlos. They've been asking Betty about him, worried about how tired he's been looking. With your permission, I'd like to let them know what's happening so they can support you both. Carlos looked at Elena, who nodded. They've been so good to us over the years. Yes, please tell them. When David returned to work the next week, he called a meeting with Betty and the entire night shift crew. He explained about Carlos's situation and the new family leave policies. This is what I learned working with all of you, David told them. Our employees aren't just workers. You're people with families, with struggles, with lives that matter. And this company should support you through the difficult times, not make them harder. Betty wiped away tears. Carlos never said a word about what he was going through. He was too proud to ask for help and too afraid of losing his job. But no one should ever have to face what he's been facing alone. Over the following weeks, David implemented sweeping changes throughout Blue Tech Manufacturing. The company established not just paid family leave, but also mental health support, childcare assistance, and flexible scheduling for employees dealing with family emergencies. Most importantly, David instituted regular leadership rounds on all shifts, ensuring that executives stayed connected with employees at every level. He also created anonymous suggestion programs with guaranteed follow-through, making sure every employee's voice could be heard. 3 weeks after David revealed his identity to Carlos, Elena passed away peacefully with her husband holding her hand. Carlos had been able to spend every moment of her final days with her, reading to her, talking about their life together, and simply being present. The entire night shift attended Elena's funeral, along with David and several other company executives. It was a celebration of a life well lived and a love that had inspired an entire company to change. When Carlos returned to work 2 months later, he found that his story had become legend among the employees. But more than that, he found a company that had truly changed. The night shift workers were no longer invisible. Their voices mattered, and when they faced difficulties, they knew they wouldn't face them alone. Carlos never went back to sleeping in supply closets, but he did continue to be the dedicated, caring employee he had always been. The difference was that now his company cared for him just as much as he cared for it. David kept the beard he had grown for his undercover assignment, and he never stopped making those late-night rounds through the building. Some lessons he learned were too important to forget.